Have you ever felt like you knew something for sure, only for new information to come along and completely flip your understanding on its head?
Oh, definitely.
Or maybe you followed common wisdom, the stuff everyone says, only to find it didn't quite work out for you in practice.
Happens all the time. Those are the moments, aren't
Yeah.
they? The aha moments.
Mhm.
Or sometimes maybe more like the wait, what moments.
Exactly.
That's when our minds really open up. We often operate on these assumptions, right? About how we think, how we interact, what drives us.
Yeah.
And those assumptions can be surprisingly far from the actual truth.
That's such a good way to put it. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into this fascinating world of human psychology.
Hmm.
We're going to sift through, well, quite a stack of research and insights. The goal is to uncover some truly surprising truths about how our minds work, how we interact, what really drives our behavior.
And challenge those assumptions.
Right. Our mission is to challenge those everyday assumptions you might hold, reveal the hidden forces at play, and, hopefully equip you with some genuine aha moments. Things that might just change the way you see the world and maybe yourself too.
Think of this as a kind of research-backed shortcut. You get to be truly well-informed on some of the most intriguing bits of the human experience.
Without reading all the studies yourself.
Exactly. We'll be drawing from a really rich collection of scientific studies, analyses.
Mhm.
Moving beyond that surface-level common sense, we want to get to the core psychological stuff.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Where should we start? How about something we all strive for? Personal growth, self-improvement.
Sounds like a great place to begin.
We often seek to improve ourselves, right? Whether it's self-help books, productivity hacks, or just, sheer willpower. We're constantly bombarded with advice, how to be better, faster, stronger. But what if some of the most common advice is actually leading us astray?
It's a real possibility. That journey of self-improvement. It's often paved with good intentions, sure, but sometimes the maps we're given are, well, flawed.
Flawed maps, I like that.
Take willpower, for instance. It's often seen as this, limitless wellspring of determination, something we can just tap into endlessly.
Just try harder, right? That's what you always hear.
That's the common belief, but the research, it tells a very different story.
Okay, how so?
Well, the sources we looked at, they confirm that willpower actually works more like a fuel tank.
A fuel tank, not infinite.
Definitely not infinite. Brain scans actually show us this. With each use of our self-control system, the activity in that specific part of the brain becomes less active.
Ah, okay.
It's like power being depleted, just like a battery running low.
So it's not just a feeling of being drained. There's a measurable neurological basis for this.
Exactly. A neurological basis.
Wow. That certainly puts those moments of weakness into a different perspective.
It does. And this mechanism helps explain some behaviors that seem kind of contradictory otherwise.
Like what?
Like why smokers who successfully manage not to smoke all day might suddenly find themselves binging on ice cream later that night.
Ah, okay. They used up their willpower on the cigarettes.
Precisely. Or, maybe even more surprising, why people who are really strictly sticking to a diet might be, statistically, more likely to cheat on their significant other.
Whoa, really?
Yeah. Their willpower has been drained by focusing so hard on the diet, leaving them more vulnerable in another area of self-control.
That makes a scary amount of sense. So, if willpower is this finite resource, this fuel tank, what's the practical application? Should we be more strategic about how we use it?
Exactly. Strategic is the word. If you try to tackle too many demanding goals all at once, let's say, you're trying to lose weight and quit smoking and start exercising daily, all simultaneously.
Which sounds like a typical New Year's resolution list.
Right. Your willpower, that fuel tank, it can drain incredibly quickly. And that often hinders all your efforts, rather than helping any single one.
So you end up achieving none of them.
Often, yes. The advice that comes out of this research is to focus your willpower. Pick one main goal at a time. Allow that fuel tank to be dedicated to that single high-priority objective.
Okay, that's a really practical way to manage willpower. But I feel like I've heard, isn't the science behind this ego depletion thing actually quite contested now?
That's a crucial point to bring up. Absolutely. Yeah. The concept that willpower is limited, often called ego depletion. Its research history is surprisingly complex and, yes, heavily debated right now.
Okay.
Early studies, some groundbreaking ones, seemed really convincing, like one where participants had to resist eating chocolate.
Okay, that requires willpower.
Definitely. And those participants, gave up twice as fast on a later unsolvable puzzle compared to participants who only had to resist radishes.
Radishes being less tempting, presumably.
Much less tempting. So that seemed like strong evidence for willpower depletion.
And those initial findings were really influential in self-help circles, weren't they? Hugely influential. An initial meta-analysis, which is like a study of studies, looked at almost 200 independent tests with over 10,000 people.
Wow.
And it initially found moderate evidence supporting ego depletion. That seemed to solidify the concept for a lot of people.
Right.
As the science evolved and methods got more rigorous, things changed. More recent studies, including ones that carefully replicated those classic designs, found no evidence for ego depletion.
No evidence at all.
None that reached statistical significance in those replications. This has opened up a massive discussion in the scientific community. There are real concerns about publication bias,
Where studies showing no effect just don't get published.
Exactly. That could have skewed the earlier perception.
So it's a pretty significant reevaluation from those early conclusions. It sounds like the foundation might not be as solid as a lot of self-help advice makes it seem. What does this mean practically then, if ego depletion isn't real, or at least heavily debated?
Okay, here's where it gets really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Almost mind-bending.
It turns out your belief about willpower seems to actually influence its effect.
Wait, what? My belief?
Yes. If you believe willpower is a limited resource,
Yeah.
you are far more likely to actually experience ego depletion. You act as if it's limited.
Okay.
But if you believe your willpower is essentially unlimited, you might just keep powering on, seemingly unaffected by whatever you did before that supposedly drained your willpower.
So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I think I'm going to run out of steam, I actually do.
The studies strongly suggest that. They've tested it directly. Participants read statements, some saying willpower is limited, others saying it's abundant.
Right.
The ones who read about limited willpower, they became ego depleted on a follow-up task. But the ones who read about unlimited willpower showed no signs of depletion.
That's incredible.
And it gets better. Long-term studies track students' beliefs about willpower over 5 weeks. The students who believed their willpower was unlimited, they procrastinated less and actually achieved higher GPAs. And this effect was strongest when they were under heavy academic workloads, exactly when you'd expect depletion to hit hardest if it were purely physiological.
This really raises a huge question. Is our belief about willpower essentially creating a self-fulfilling prophecy?
It certainly looks that way.
It's like our mind is convincing itself of its own limitations, or lack thereof.
It truly seems like it. So for now, given this ongoing scientific debate and these fascinating findings about belief, it's probably best not to base your entire life-hacking strategy solely on the concept of ego depletion.
Right. Maybe don't assume you have to run out of willpower.
Exactly. The science is still evolving, and our own mindset, our beliefs, appear to play a much more powerful role than we might have thought.
That's a really powerful thought to kick us off. And speaking of willpower and self-improvement, what happens when we inevitably do stumble? We mess up, we break the diet, we procrastinate. We often feel immense guilt afterwards. Is that guilt a good motivator? Does it help us get back on track?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But counterintuitively, the research says no. Our sources consistently show that self-acceptance is actually much better than guilt.
Better than guilt. How?
Well, when you fail, let's stick with the diet example, you eat that cookie you weren't supposed to be. That feeling of guilt puts you in a bad mood.
Makes sense.
And when we're in a bad mood, fMRI scans show something interesting happens in the brain. It actually switches into a reward-seeking state.
Reward-seeking. Why?
To feel better quickly. We crave immediate gratification to lift that bad mood, which unfortunately often comes at the expense of our long-term goals. It can lead to this really vicious cycle.
So the very emotion we think will kick us into gear, the guilt might actually push us further off track by making us seek more rewards, like more cookies.
Precisely. It's completely counterintuitive, but that seems to be the mechanism. It was this compelling experiment.
Tell me.
Women who were on a diet were given a donut. Naturally, this induced feelings of guilt. Then, half of them received a simple message designed to relieve that guilt. Something straightforward like, look, everyone makes mistakes sometimes. We shouldn't be too hard on ourselves.
That's a little self-compassion message.
Exactly. The other half got no such message. Afterwards, both groups were offered candy, supposedly as part of a taste test.
Yeah.
The results were stark. The group whose guilt had been relieved, they ate only about 28 grams of candy on average. But the other group, the ones still feeling guilty, They ate almost 70 grams.
Wow, more than double just from that simple guilt-relieving message.
More than double. It's a huge difference for such a small intervention.
So the application here seems really clear. Don't beat yourself up so much when you stumble.
That's exactly right. Self-forgiveness, rather than self-condemnation, appears to be a key component in getting back on track. It helps break that destructive cycle of guilt leading to more indulgence.
Okay, that's myth number one. Busted guilt isn't the best motivator. What about another really common piece of self-help advice? I know I've heard this countless times. Visualize yourself achieving your goal. Dream big. Picture the success vividly. Is that actually helpful?
Ah, visualization. Again, it sounds great and it's incredibly popular. But surprisingly, the research suggests that simply imagining yourself achieving a goal can actually hurt your chances of success.
Hurt them. How can picturing success be bad?
It sounds completely counter to that popular wisdom, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But the evidence is quite compelling. For example, one study looked at obese women needing to lose weight. Those who had the most positive, detailed fantasies about reaching their weight goals. They actually lost the least amount of weight over the study period.
The least, that's the opposite of what you'd expect.
Exactly. Or consider this fascinating real-world example. When McDonald's introduced healthier menu options like salads, you'd think this would lead to healthier overall choices.
Logically, yes.
But paradoxically, sales of Big Macs actually skyrocketed.
Skyrocketed, what?
The researchers believe it's because customers would visualize themselves choosing the healthy salad option. That mental act, that visualization, made them feel like they had already made progress towards being healthy.
Ah, like they mentally checked the healthy choice box.
Precisely. And since the brain perceives that progress has been made, it sort of gives permission for indulgence. It allows you to order the Big Mac because you feel like you've already been virtuous, even though you haven't actually done anything differently in the real world.
So it's almost like a psychological loophole that lets us off the hook from taking actual action.
That's a great way to put it. Fantasizing tricks the brain into thinking the desired state is already achieved, reducing the motivation to put in the actual effort.
That's a fascinating insight into why just wishing or visualizing isn't enough. Action is key.
Absolutely. It highlights the critical importance of action over mere mental rehearsal when it comes to achieving difficult goals.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Moving from personal achievement, let's talk about creativity. When we think of creativity, we often picture artists, musicians, writers, but it's so much broader than that, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Creativity isn't just confined to the artsy fields. It's a crucial skill for breakthroughs in science, in business, even in everyday problem solving.
Can you give an example?
Sure, think about that classic riddle, the tumor problem. How do you destroy a malignant tumor deep inside a patient with a high-intensity ray without damaging the surrounding healthy tissue?
That sounds tricky. A high-intensity ray would harm everything in its path.
Exactly. The creative solution isn't one powerful ray. It's mounting, say, 10 low-intensity ray guns all around the patient. Each individual ray is too weak to harm the healthy tissue it passes through.
Okay.
But you focus all 10 rays on the tumor itself. At that focal point, the combined intensity is high enough to destroy the tumor while the surrounding tissue remains safe.
That's brilliant. A truly creative, outside-the-box solution.
It perfectly illustrates how creativity is about finding novel connections and solutions, not just artistic expression. It's so important, in fact, that a 2010 IBM survey of over 1,500 CEOs ranked creativity as the single most important leadership quality for success in the future.
The most important quality. Wow. Okay, so if it's that crucial, how can we foster it? Our sources must have some tips.
They do indeed. And some of them are quite interesting, perhaps even counterintuitive again.
All right, let's hear them. What's the first tip for boosting creativity?
Tip number 1, relax rather than concentrating harder.
Relax. But don't creative breakthroughs require intense focus?
You'd think so, but consider this. Ever wonder why so many people claim their best ideas come to them during long, hot showers, or while walking, or doing something else relaxing?
Yeah, the shower epiphany thing is classic.
It's not just a cliche, there's a reason for it. When we concentrate really intensely, our minds tend to focus narrowly on the specific details of the problem. It creates this sort of narrow tunnel of attention, which can be good for analytical tasks, but it can actually prevent us from seeing the bigger picture or making those unusual connections needed for creative leaps.
So trying too hard can actually block creativity.
In a way, yes. When we relax, our attention broadens. It becomes more diffuse. This allows seemingly random thoughts, memories, and ideas from the peripheries of our mind to enter our awareness and combine in novel, unexpected ways.
That makes sense.
Multiple studies link this broadening of attention directly to increased creativity. Interestingly, even individuals diagnosed with ADHD,
Yeah.
despite their attention deficit, they often perform better on certain creative tests and have more real-life creative achievements. Why? Because their less focused attention in this specific context helps them generate more original ideas by not getting stuck down one single thought pathway.
Wow, so a perceived weakness can be a creative strength.
Exactly. Companies like Google have even recognized this. They actively encourage employees to take breaks, play games, step away from their desk when they feel stuck on a problem. Relaxation breeds creativity.
That's a great takeaway. What's the next piece of advice for cultivating creativity?
Tip number 2, don't be afraid to take risks. Or, maybe put another way, try to lower your inhibition.
Okay, how does risk-taking relate to creativity?
Well, the fear of making a mistake, of being wrong, looking foolish, or producing something unconventional, that fear often stops us dead in our tracks creatively.
The inner critic.
Precisely. To illustrate this, fMRI scans have looked at the brains of freestyle rappers while they're improvising.
Okay.
They show decreased activity in a specific brain region called the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. This area is heavily involved in self-monitoring, planning, and inhibition, basically, the brain's editor or sensor.
So their inner critic goes quiet.
Exactly. The same thing happens with experienced jazz musicians during improvisation. To produce something truly new and unconventional, you have to be willing to let go, take risks, and venture beyond the safe and familiar.
That makes sense.
And it follows that people who are more susceptible to peer pressure, who worry more about what others think, tend to be less creative. But here's the good news.
Yeah.
Creativity isn't solely an innate talent you're born with. It seems to be a skill that can be learned and improved. Studies have shown that merely telling people to be more individualistic, more independent in their thinking, actually improves their scores on creativity tests.
So you can train yourself to be less inhibited.
It suggests you can cultivate that mindset, yes.
Mhm.
Daring to be different, embracing the possibility of failure as part of the process.
That's really empowering, knowing that creativity isn't just some fixed trait. Okay, what's the third tip?
Tip number 3 is simple. Sleep on it.
Literally sleep on it, like take a nap.
Yes, literally. It might sound like old folk wisdom, but surprisingly, taking a nap or even just getting a good night's sleep can significantly increase your chances of breaking through a creative block.
How does that work?
There was an experiment where participants were given a problem that required a tricky, abstract insight to solve. Some were allowed to sleep between being exposed to the problem and trying to solve it again, while others stayed awake.
And the sleepers did better?
They were twice as likely to solve the problem.
Twice as likely. Wow.
Psychologists believe this is due to something called the incubation effect. The idea is that even when you're not consciously thinking about the problem, especially during sleep, your unconscious mind continues to work on it in the background.
Mulling it over subconsciously.
Exactly, recombining thoughts, memories, and ideas in novel ways, free from the constraints of conscious focus. This allows new connections and solutions to emerge. Paul McCartney famously claimed the melody for Yesterday, one of the most covered songs ever, came to him fully formed in a dream.
That's an amazing anecdote.
It is. And it's not just anecdotes. A meta-analysis looking at dozens of studies confirms this incubation effect is a real phenomenon. So, next time you're really stuck on a creative problem, stepping away and literally sleeping on it might be one of the most effective strategies you can use.
Okay, so to recap the creativity section, relax, don't concentrate harder, take risks and lower inhibition, and sleep on it. Fascinating. But thinking about all this advice, willpower, creativity, self-help, what about some of the other really common self-help advice out there? Does it all hold up when you put it under the scientific microscope?
Yeah, that's a great question. And unfortunately, many popular self-help myths don't really hold water. In fact, some can have unintended negative consequences.
Okay, let's debunk some. What's myth number 1?
Myth number 1, the classic try not to think about it. When something horrible happens or you're worried about something, friends often say, just try to push it out of your mind. Don't dwell on it. Seems like sensible advice, right? Protect yourself from negative thoughts.
Sounds reasonable. Distraction.
It feels intuitive, but psychology has known for a long time that actively trying to suppress thoughts tends to backfire spectacularly. It's sometimes called the ironic process theory or the white bear problem.
The white bear problem.
Yeah, try not to think about a white bear for the next minute.
Pause. Okay, now all I can think about is white bear.
Exactly. The very act of trying not to think about something makes you think about it more. In one experiment, participants were asked to describe upsetting, self-related thoughts. Things like, I'm worthless or I'll never succeed.
Okay.
Then they were told to actively push these thoughts out of their minds for 11 days. What happened? This group actually became more anxious, more depressed, and reported lower self-esteem compared to a control group.
So the effort to suppress made them feel worse. The very thing they tried to avoid ended up haunting them more.
Precisely. It's that ironic twist again. The same effect applies in other areas too. Eaters told specifically, don't think about chocolate, end up eating more chocolate later. Smokers told, don't think about smoking, actually end up smoking more cigarettes.
So what's the alternative? If suppression backfires, what should you do with unwanted thoughts?
The alternative, supported by research, is not to fight them or suppress them, but to simply acknowledge them. Allow them to be there, observe them without judgment, almost like clouds passing in the sky.
Just notice them.
Just notice them.
Yeah.
Over time, those worrying thoughts will naturally run their course and fade without the added mental energy and rebound effect caused by active suppression. Acceptance, not suppression.
That's a really powerful shift in approach. Okay, what's the next common myth we need to be wary of?
Myth number 2, using self-affirmations when you have low self-esteem. You know the kind of phrases, I am worthy of love, I am successful, I am strong. They're incredibly popular in self-help books and workshops.
Yes, positive affirmations. They seem harmless enough.
And studies do show that self-affirmation can work for some people under certain circumstances. But, and this is a huge, often overlooked caveat, it often doesn't work for people with genuinely low self-esteem.
Wait, the very people who you'd think need them the most, they don't benefit. How does that happen?
It seems paradoxical. Researchers suggest that when individuals who already have a low opinion of themselves encounter these overly positive global statements, I am wonderful, they simply don't believe them. The statement feels inauthentic, maybe even delusional, compared to their deep-seated negative self-view.
So it flashes with their internal reality.
Exactly. And instead of challenging that negative self-view, this clash, this disbelief, can actually strengthen it. It makes them feel even worse, perhaps highlighting the gap between the affirmation and how they truly feel.
So it backfires too.
It can, yes. The caution here is, if your self-esteem is genuinely low, you need to be very careful with overly broad, positive self-affirmations. They might not be the right tool. It might be more effective to focus on smaller, more believable positive steps, or address the root causes of that low self-esteem through other means, perhaps therapy.
That's really important context. Okay, and the last self-help myth we're tackling in this segment.
Myth number 3, the idea that you should let your anger out. Everyone seems to agree that bottling up anger is bad for you, right? And that it's better to vent it safely, yell into a pillow, smash plates, maybe not, hit a punching bag. Catharsis,
Yeah.
right?
Catharsis, get it out of your system. That sounds logical.
It sounds logical, it feels intuitive. But this advice generally lacks scientific support.
Wait, seriously. So venting anger might make you angrier. That goes against everything I've ever heard about anger management.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But consider the research. In one classic experiment, participants were deliberately made angry. Then, one group was told to let out their anger by hitting a punching bag. Another group was told to just sit quietly in an empty room for the same amount of time.
Okay, the venting group versus the calm down group.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What happened? The participants who vented their anger on the punching bag actually reported feeling angrier afterwards compared to those who simply sat quietly.
Angrier, not relieved.
Angrier. And not only that, they also acted more aggressively towards others in a subsequent task. So, far from being a healthy release or catharsis, physically venting anger seemed to actually escalate the anger and aggression.
That's a crucial distinction. So if hitting a pillow isn't the answer, what's the recommended alternative then? If bottling up is bad and venting is bad, what's left?
The research points towards letting anger out more constructively. This means, instead of just physically venting the emotion, focusing on discussing the source of the anger, communicating why you are angry in a way that aims to resolve the situation or solve the underlying problem.
So using the anger signal to address the issue, not just release the feeling.
Exactly. It's about channeling that energy into productive communication and problem solving, rather than just reinforcing the angry state through physical expression.
Wow. Okay, that wraps up our first segment on personal growth and self-improvement. We've seen how willpower is complex, maybe more about belief than we thought, how self-acceptance trumps guilt, why visualizing success can backfire, and how common advice about thought suppression, affirmations, and venting anger might not be so helpful after all.
A lot of common sense turned on its head.
Definitely. Next up, we're going to dive into how our brains actually make decisions and the hidden biases and mental shortcuts that influence us every single day.
This is where things get really fascinating, looking under the hood of our own thinking.
Our brains are incredibly powerful, right? Capable of complex thought, abstract reasoning, amazing things. But as we're learning, they also come with these built-in biases, these mental shortcuts, heuristics, I think they're called.
That's right, heuristics, mental shortcuts.
And these can lead us to make some pretty irrational decisions sometimes. Lose money, maybe believe things that are completely false, without even realizing why. So let's explore some of these top cognitive biases that seem to frequently cloud our judgment.
It's a slightly sobering thought, isn't it? That our own minds can be working against our best interests without us even being aware.
Definitely. Where should we start? Which bias first?
Let's start with a very common one, something most of us probably do. The self-serving bias.
Ah, yes. I think I know this one. This is where we take all the credit for our successes, but blame failure on everything but ourselves.
That's it, exactly. This bias means we attribute any success to our own internal qualities. If we charm someone, it's because we are charming. If we ace a test, it's because we're smart.
Right. Our own awesomeness.
But when we fail, suddenly it's external. We blame the situation, other people, bad luck, they just don't get me, or the circumstances were totally against me.
It certainly sounds like a convenient way to protect our ego. Keep feeling good about ourselves.
It absolutely is a protective mechanism for self-esteem. And there's evidence for that. For instance, people suffering from depression often show significant less of this bias. They tend to be more accurate, sometimes brutally so, in attributing failures to themselves.
That's interesting. So there is a link between maybe less accurate self-perception and better mood, in a way.
It seems so. But here's the crucial downside of the self-serving bias. It fundamentally stops us from learning from our mistakes.
How so?
Because if we never take responsibility for our failures, if it's always something or someone else's fault, we have no incentive to change our own behavior or approach next time. We just keep doing the same thing, blaming the world when it doesn't work out.
Okay, that's a serious drawback. So how do we correct for something that seems so deeply ingrained, so automatic?
Well, interestingly, research shows that this self-serving bias tends to significantly diminish or even disappear when you're interacting with close, trusted friends.
Really? Why with friends?
Presumably because we feel safer, less defensive, and perhaps they provide honest feedback. So a good practical correction strategy is to actively cultivate friendships with people who aren't afraid to call you out sometimes, who can offer that grounded perspective and keep you honest with yourself.
Having friends who tell you the truth, even when it's uncomfortable.
Exactly. They provide that external reality check that our own biased minds often need.
Okay, that's helpful advice. Let's move to the next bias. This is one I've heard described as potentially one of the most dangerous, confirmation bias. Why is it considered so dangerous?
Confirmation bias is seen as particularly dangerous because it shapes how we seek out and interpret information in the world. It basically means we have a strong tendency to only search for, pay attention to, and favor evidence that confirms the beliefs we already hold.
So we look for proof that we're right and ignore anything that suggests we might be wrong.
Precisely. And you can see how this simple bias can explain so much. Why people cling tightly to unscientific beliefs, why political polarization gets so extreme, why people only seem to get one side of a complex story.
Yeah.
If someone believes, say, that humans are inherently good, they'll actively look for examples of kindness and altruism and conveniently overlook or explain away evidence of cruelty or selfishness. They end up with a severely skewed picture of reality that just reinforces their starting point.
And it even affects how we interpret simple questions, doesn't it?
Yes, the way a question is framed becomes incredibly important because of confirmation bias. There's a classic example. Ask people, are you happy with your social life? And they generally report greater satisfaction than if you ask them, are you unhappy with your social life?
Even though it's probing the same area.
Yes, because the first question prompts them to search their memory for confirming evidence happy social events. The second question prompts a search for unhappy social events. They find what they look for, and it influences their answer.
That's subtle but powerful. So given how automatic this seems, how can we actively prevent ourselves from falling into the confirmation bias trap?
The single best strategy is to make a conscious, deliberate effort to actively search for contradicting evidence. Force yourself to look at the other side.
Like playing devil's advocate with yourself.
Exactly. If you think stock markets are definitely going to rise, make yourself first research all the reasons why they might actually fall.
Hmm.
If you're convinced a certain medical treatment like acupuncture will work for you, first spend time searching for studies or evidence showing why it doesn't work or where it failed.
That sounds effortful.
It is effortful.
Yeah.
It goes against our natural tendency. But doing that deliberately helps ensure your decision isn't just confirming what you already wanted to believe. It helps you consider all angles.
That's a really practical step anyone can take. Okay, now let's move on to something slightly different. The unexpected power of how information is presented and how prior information affects us. Let's start with something called cognitive fluency.
Right, cognitive fluency. This basically refers to how easy an idea or piece of information is to process, understand, and think about. The bias here is that the more fluent, the easier something feels to process, the more we unconsciously trust it and believe it to be true.
So easy equals true in our subconscious mind.
Pretty much. It leads to what psychologists call the illusion of truth. For example, experiments have shown that simply writing a statement or message in a clearer, easier-to-read font makes people more likely to think that statement is true, compared to the exact same statement in a slightly blurry or difficult font.
Just the font. That's wild.
Just the font. Or another fascinating example, subjects were asked to read the insightfulness of proverbs. They found the proverb, "Woes unite foes," which rhymes nicely, significantly more insightful and profound than the proverb, "Woes unite enemies."
Even though they mean the exact same thing.
Exactly the same meaning, but the rhyming version is more cognitively fluent, it flows better, feels easier, and so is perceived as truer or wiser.
That seems almost manipulative. How does this cognitive fluency bias play out in the real world, maybe with bigger consequences?
It can definitely lead to some poor decisions, especially in areas like finance. There was a study looking at the stock market. On the very first day a company's stock starts trading, those stocks with ticker codes that were easy to pronounce, like, say, KAGI, tended to rise about 30% more in value than stocks with unpronounceable codes like RDO.
30% more, just because the name rolled off the tongue better.
Apparently so. The fluency of the names seemed to trick traders into feeling more confident about the stock itself without any actual basis in the company's fundamentals. And sure enough,
It didn't last.
nope. After about 6 months, those easily pronounceable stocks fell back to the average market performance. The fluency effect was temporary, but it influenced initial investment decisions.
That's a really powerful warning then. So the takeaway is, next time something just sounds about right or feels really easy and obvious.
That's precisely the moment you should pause and start questioning it a bit more critically. That feeling of ease, that fluency, might be subtly misleading you.
Good advice. Okay, next up, the sunk cost fallacy. This is one I think a lot of people can relate to, maybe without knowing the name.
Oh, absolutely. The sunk cost fallacy stems from our intense aversion to loss, particularly the feeling of having wasted something.
Okay, explain it.
Imagine you've paid, say, $20 for a ticket to see a 2-hour movie. You're sitting there, and after just 1 hour, you realize you absolutely hate this movie. It's terrible. You want to leave,
Okay.
but you think, well, I've already paid $20. If I leave now, I'll have wasted my money. So you force yourself to sit through the second equally terrible hour.
Right, trying to get your money's worth.
Exactly. But think about it logically. You've already lost the $20. That money is gone whether you stay or leave. It's a sunk cost. By staying for that second miserable hour on top of the lost $20, you've now also wasted another hour of your precious time you could have spent doing something enjoyable.
Okay, so staying actually makes it worse. You lose the money and the time.
Precisely. You'd have been better off cutting your losses and leaving after the first hour. This fallacy stems from that strong emotional aversion to feeling like we've wasted resources, money, time, effort. It motivates us to carry on with something even when it's clearly a lost cause, just to avoid admitting the initial investment was a waste.
And this doesn't just apply to small things like movies or money, right? It can trap people in much bigger, more significant situations.
Absolutely. The sunk cost fallacy plays a huge role in why people stay in bad jobs, failing projects, or even unhappy relationships.
Relationships? How?
If you've been together with someone for years, maybe invested a lot of emotional energy, time, effort, you might feel like it'd be such a waste of all that investment to break up now. Even if you're unhappy, you cling to the slim chance it might get better, because the alternative feels like admitting all those past years were wasted.
That's a tough trap.
It is. But rationally, The key is always to focus on the future costs and benefits of your decision, not the past investments. Those past resources, those sunk costs, are gone, regardless of what you do next. Don't let them chain you to a bad future decision.
That's a difficult but really important truth to face. Okay, now let's talk about a simple little riddle or a test that supposedly trips up even very smart people, like Harvard students, and how a simple trick with fonts can dramatically change how well people do on it.
Yes, this is fascinating stuff related to how our brain processes information. It involves a cognitive reflection test, or CRT, developed by Professor Shane Frederick at Yale.
Okay.
Let's try one of the questions. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs exactly $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost?
Hmm. Okay, my immediate gut reaction is 10 cents. Because $1 plus 10 cents is $1.10.
And that's the common intuitive answer. It's what jumps into most people's minds straight away. And apparently, more than 50% of Harvard students who took this test got it wrong, giving that same initial answer.
So 10 cents is wrong.
It is wrong. Think about it. If the ball was 10 cents and the bat is $1 more, the bat would be $1.10. Together, that would be $1.20, not $1.10.
Ah, right, right. Okay. Let me think. So the difference needs to be $1, maybe 5 cents. If the ball is 5 cents, the bat is $1 for 5, and together that's $1.10.
Exactly. The correct answer is 5 cents.
Wow, okay. My first instinct was totally wrong.
And that's the point of the test. The CRT is designed to measure how well people can suppress that initial, quick, intuitive reaction, System 1, in favor of a more thoughtful, analytical answer that requires effort, System 2. It really highlights how our brains operate using these two distinct patterns of thinking.
System 1 versus System 2 thinking, right? I think
Yeah.
Daniel Kahneman wrote about this.
Exactly. System 1 thinking is fast, automatic, intuitive, effortless. It's what lets you instantly recognize a friend's face, answer simple math like 1 plus 1 is 2, or jump to that 10 cents answer for the bat and ball problem. Our brains operate in this mode most of the time because it's efficient.
And System 2.
System 2 thinking is the opposite. Slow, deliberate, analytical, and effortful. This is the mode that kicks in when you really concentrate on a complex problem, like working through the logic of the bat and ball riddle to arrive at 5 cents.
So we tend to default to the quick, easy way, System 1. How does the font trick come into play here?
This is the truly fascinating part. Researchers found that if you present these same CRT questions in a font that is deliberately harder to read, maybe slightly blurry or an unusual script,
Okay.
performance on the test dramatically improves. In one study, when the questions were hard to read, 65% of people got all 3 questions correct. That's a staggering improvement compared to when the font was clear and easy.
That's incredible. Why on earth would making something harder to read make us smarter at answering it?
It works because the hard-to-read font induces what's called cognitive strain. When something is difficult to process, when it requires effort just to decipher, it acts like an alarm signal to your brain.
An alarm signal.
Yeah, it basically says, hey, pay attention. This isn't easy. Engage the heavy machinery. It prompts your brain to switch out of the automatic, potentially error-prone System 1 thinking and into the more deliberate, careful System 2 thinking.
So the difficulty itself forces you to slow down and think more deeply.
Exactly. And this same effect isn't just for riddles. It's been shown to improve memory and learning, too. There was a study in a public school in Ohio where teachers used difficult-to-read fonts like, say, Monotype Cursiva or Hand Schweiler in some classroom worksheets.
Okay.
The students who got those worksheets with the difficult fonts actually scored significantly higher on subsequent tests covering that material compared to students in classes using standard, easy-to-read fonts.
So a little bit of friction, a bit of difficulty actually helps us process information more deeply and learn better.
It appears so. The struggle to read forces deeper engagement with the material. But there's also a potential dark side to this fluency effect, isn't there?
Right. How can this effect be used against us?
Well, just as difficulty triggers System 2, excessive ease keeps us in System 1. So this effect can be used to fool you. If a statement, let's take a potentially false one, like Adolf Hitler was born in 1892, the actual year is 1889, is presented in a very clear, highly readable font.
Yeah.
People are more likely to rate that statement as true. They're also more likely to believe it comes from a more expert or credible source, simply because the ease of reading keeps them in that less critical System 1 mode.
Yeah.
Without the trigger of cognitive strain, they're less likely to question it or engage their analytical thinking.
That's a really subtle but potentially dangerous form of manipulation, making misinformation look easy to digest.
It is. So how can we use this knowledge of cognitive strain to our advantage in a positive way.
Good question.
Here's a practical trick, especially useful for something like proofreading. When you're reading over your own resume or an important essay you've written, the words are so familiar that your brain just glides over them in System 1. It's incredibly easy to miss typos or grammatical errors.
Yeah, I know that feeling. You read it 10 times and still miss something obvious.
Exactly. So next time you need to proofread something important, try this. Change the font to something unfamiliar and maybe slightly difficult to read, like Comic Sans, if you can bear it, or a script font.
Okay, why?
Because the increased cognitive strain from the unfamiliar font will force your brain to slow down, engage System 2, and process the text more carefully. You'll be much better at spotting those elusive errors because you're not just skimming automatically. It forces deeper engagement.
That's a brilliant practical hack for something we all struggle with. Change the font to proofread better. I'll remember that one. Okay, now let's explore some key external influences on our judgment, starting with something called the halo effect.
Right, the halo effect. This is a really pervasive bias. It occurs when our overall impression of a person, a company, a brand, or even a product in one area positively influences our feelings and thoughts about their other unrelated traits or characteristics.
So, if someone is good at one thing, or we like one aspect of them, we tend to assume they're good at everything, or that everything about them is positive.
Precisely. We see one positive trait, maybe someone is physically attractive, or a company has a cool logo, and that positive glow, that halo, spreads to color our judgment of their other qualities, like their intelligence, their competence, or their trustworthiness, whether it's accurate or not.
Can you give a real-world example?
A perfect and perhaps infamous example from the online world was the Fine Bros fiasco on YouTube a while back. Remember their React videos?
Vaguely, yeah. They were huge.
They were huge. Their channel had really high production value, great sound, slick editing, and their videos consistently had almost 100% like ratings on YouTube. This created a powerful positive halo effect around them and their content.
Okay, so people saw them as generally good, trustworthy creators.
Exactly. And this meant that when they announced their controversial React World initiative, essentially trying to license and control the React video format, many initially ambiguous or questionable motives behind it went largely unnoticed by their fan base. The halo blinded people. Worse, criticisms posted in comments were often actively deleted, which further reinforced the illusion of unanimous support for what many later recognized as a pretty dodgy business model.
So the positive halo hid the potential negatives.
It did, for a time. And this effect extends beyond companies, very powerfully to people too, especially based on attractiveness.
Ah, the attractiveness bias. Is
Right.
that part of the halo effect?
It's a classic manifestation of it. There was an experiment where male participants were asked to grade a badly written essay. One group was shown a photo of an attractive female presented as the author. The other group saw a photo of an unattractive female as the author. The essay was identical.
And the grades were different.
Massively different. The males were much more lenient towards the attractive author, giving her essay an average score of 5.2 out of 9. The unattractive author. She received only 2.7 out of 9 for the exact same badly written essay.
Wow. Physical attractiveness literally meant the difference between a passing grade and a failing grade.
For the same work. That's the halo effect in action. Our perception of one trait, attractiveness, created a halo that drastically altered the judgment of another unrelated trait, writing ability.
That's a really stark illustration. So the caution here is to be acutely aware of this bias, especially when consuming content or evaluating people or products that seem maybe deceptively attractive in some superficial way.
Absolutely. Always try to judge different qualities independently. Be aware of that initial positive glow and question if it's unduly influencing your assessment of other aspects. Its power to sway judgment is really significant.
Okay, duly noted. Finally, in this section on biases, let's talk about anchoring. This sounds like something used constantly in marketing and negotiation.
Oh, anchoring is huge. It's another powerful subconscious process that heavily influences our judgments, especially when we're dealing with numbers or making decisions in unfamiliar situations.
How does it work? What's the anchor?
Essentially, our minds tend to rely too heavily on the first piece of information offered when making decisions. That first piece of information acts as an anchor. All subsequent thoughts, judgments, and counteroffers are then interpreted and adjusted based relative to that initial anchor, even if the anchor itself is completely arbitrary or irrelevant.
Okay, give us an example. That sounds a bit abstract.
Sure, let's use the classic shoes example. Imagine you're browsing in a store and you see a really hot pair of shoes you like. You check the price tag, $300. Ouch, too expensive. You sigh, maybe start to walk away.
Okay.
But just then, a salesperson rushes over and says, "Good news. Those shoes you're looking at, they just got marked down today to $150. Now, how do you feel?"
Like it's a bargain. Half price. I'd be way more tempted to buy them.
Exactly. That $150 feels like a great deal because your mind was initially anchored to the $300 price. Now imagine the same scenario, same shoes, but you walk in and the price tag starts at $150. There's no markdown mentioned.
Then $150 might still feel a bit expensive. I'd be more hesitant, less excited.
Precisely. Even though the final price you pay is the exact same, $150 in both scenarios, your perception of its value is completely different because of the initial anchor. $300 versus $150.
That's so subtle and yet clearly so effective. I can easily see how marketers would exploit this constantly.
They do all the time. Supermarkets are masters of this. For instance, one supermarket study tested putting up a sign for Campbell's soup cans that said 10% off. Sales increased a bit, but then they tried a sign that said 10% off, limit of 12 per customer.
A limit? Why would they limit sales if they want to sell more?
But the limit wasn't really about limiting sales. Even if you had no intention of buying anywhere near 12 cans, that number 12 acted as a powerful anchor in shoppers' minds.
So it made them think about a higher quantity.
Exactly. And sure enough, with that limit 12 sign, shoppers bought an average of 7 cans of soup, each, which was twice as many as they bought when the sign just said 10% off, with no limit mentioned. That simple anchor doubled the average purchase quantity.
That's incredible. Sneaky, but incredible. Okay, so if marketers use it against us, how can we use anchoring to our advantage, say, in negotiations?
There are 2 key tactics that come out of the research on anchoring in negotiation. First, wherever possible, try to be the one who makes the initial offer.
Go first. Why?
An analysis looking at 16 different negotiation studies found that, consistently, the party who makes the first offer tends to end up with a better outcome. Why? Because your first offer sets the anchor. It establishes the playing field, and the other party's subsequent thinking and counteroffers will revolve around your initial number, not theirs.
Okay, so drop the anchor first. What's the second tip?
The second tip is related. Make your first offer precise.
Precise. What do you mean? Like not a round number?
Exactly. Ever wonder why cars are often listed for sale at prices like $16,997 instead of just $17,000? Or houses for $499,500 instead of $500,000?
Yeah, it seems like a weird marketing gimmick.
It's actually based on anchoring research. Studies found that when you make a precise first offer, like $16,997, it subtly anchors the other person to think on a more precise scale. They perceive that you've thought about the value very carefully, down to the dollar or even cents.
Okay, and how does that help?
It makes them adjust their counteroffers in smaller increments. If you offer around $17,000, they might think in terms of thousands or hundreds and counter much lower, maybe $16,000. But if you offer the precise $16,997, they're anchored to that finer scale and might only adjust downwards by a smaller amount, staying much closer to your initial bid.
That's incredibly sneaky, but makes total sense. So offer first and offer precisely.
Those seem to be the power moves, according to the research on anchoring in negotiation. Always be mindful of the anchor, whether you're setting it or reacting to someone else's.
Definitely something to keep in mind next time you're haggling or even just shopping. Okay, that's a great look at some key cognitive biases.
Yeah, the self-serving bias, confirmation bias, fluency, sunk costs, halo effect, anchoring. They're working away under the surface all the time.
So far, we've focused mainly on our individual minds, how we think, how we try to improve ourselves, the biases that affect our decisions. But beyond our internal landscape, psychology also sheds a fascinating light on the subtle and often surprising ways we influence each other and navigate the complexities of society as a whole.
Absolutely. We don't exist in a vacuum. We're part of this vast, interconnected web. And our actions, our moods, even our mere presence can have ripple effects we rarely consider.
Okay, so let's delve into that social dimension. Where do we start?
Let's start with the power of social networks themselves, specifically with something called the 3 degrees of influence.
Yeah.
Most people have probably heard of 6 degrees of separation, right? The idea that we're all connected to anyone else in the world through about 6 intermediate acquaintances.
Yeah, Kevin Bacon game and all that.
Exactly. But 3 degrees of influence takes it a step further. It's not just about connection. It's about how far influence behaviors, moods, ideas actually travels through those connections.
So my influence extends beyond just my direct friends. How far?
The research suggests it extends surprisingly far, up to 3 degrees away. So to your friends, that's 1 degree. To your friends' friends, 2 degrees. And even to your friends' friends' friends, 3 degrees.
3 steps away. How did they figure that out?
There was a groundbreaking study, part of the larger Framingham Heart study, that followed nearly 5,000 people for over 20 years, mapping out their social connections. They looked at various factors, including happiness.
And what did they find about happiness spreading?
It was remarkable. They found that if one person in the network became happy, a direct friend of theirs living nearby had a 15% increased chance of becoming happy themselves.
Okay, that makes sense. Happiness is contagious among friends.
But it didn't stop there. A friend of that friend, someone 2 degrees removed from the original person, had a 10% increased chance of being happy. And even at 3 degrees of separation, a friend's friend's friend, someone the original person likely doesn't even know there was still a statistically significant 6% increased chance of happiness.
That's incredible. A
Yeah.
ripple effect extending 3 layers out. So my mood, my happiness could literally be affecting the mood of someone I've never met.
The data strongly suggests yes. And it's not just happiness. This 3 degrees rule seems to apply to a really diverse range of phenomena. Things like obesity trends spreading through networks, patterns of smoking cessation, cooperative behavior, political mobilization, and even feelings of loneliness.
Wow. So a random act of kindness I do could potentially cascade through the network and make someone 3 steps away more likely to help someone else.
That's the fascinating implication, yes. Your behavior influences people you don't even know, and conversely, you are being influenced by people you've never met 3 degrees out in your social network.
This really raises a significant question then. Should you be very, very aware of who you choose to hang around with? Because their influence, positive or negative, could be rippling outwards through you, and their network's influence is rippling inwards towards you.
It's a very valid question to ponder based on this research. While it's probably not a strict deterministic rule for everything, the general principle that behaviors, moods, and states ripple through our social networks up to about 3 degrees seems quite compelling. It highlights our interconnectedness.
Definitely something to think about. Now, on the flip side of influence, when you're actively looking for something new, maybe information or an opportunity like finding a new job,
Yeah.
most people instinctively turn to their closest friends, right? Their strong ties.
Mm.
Is that actually the most effective approach?
That is the common intuitive approach. We assume the people closest to us, who know us best and presumably care most about us, will be the most helpful.
Seems logical.
It does. But this leads us to another one of those counterintuitive principles from social network analysis, known as the strength of weak ties.
The strength of weak ties. That sounds like a paradox.
It does. But the research, pioneered by sociologist Mark Granovetter, suggests that in reality, our weak ties, meaning acquaintances, people we know less well, maybe see infrequently, are often more likely to be the source of novel information, like job leads, than our close friends.
More likely. Why on earth would someone you barely know be more helpful in finding a job than your best friend?
It comes down to the structure of social networks and information flow. Think about that saying, birds of a feather flock together. Our strong ties, our close friends, tend to be very similar to us.
Yeah, usually share similar backgrounds, interests, maybe work in similar fields.
Exactly. They often belong to the same social cluster or network that we do. And because of this overlap, they tend to have access to much of the same information that we already have. They know the same people, hear about the same opportunities within our shared circle.
So they're less likely to bring new information to the table.
Precisely. Weak ties, on the other hand, are acquaintances who are, by definition, less connected to our immediate circle. They bridge different networks, different backgrounds, different industries.
Ah, so they have access to different information streams.
Exactly. Because they're part of different networks, they're much more likely to have access to new information, fresh perspectives, opportunities that we and our close friends would never have heard about otherwise.
Is there solid evidence for this?
Yes, Granovetter's original study and subsequent research backs this up strongly. One study, for instance, looked at how people actually found their jobs. It found that only about 16% of people found their job through a contact they saw regularly, a strong tie. The vast majority, over 80%, came from contacts they saw only occasionally or rarely, weak ties.
Over 80% from weak ties? That's astonishing.
It gets even more specific. You are apparently almost twice as likely to get a job lead from someone you rarely spoke to compared to someone you contacted regularly.
That's a truly powerful, counterintuitive insight. It means we should probably be intentionally cultivating and maintaining those weaker ties, not just focusing on our inner circle.
That seemed to be the strategic implication, yes. And this isn't just limited to finding jobs. The principle applies to finding a new romantic partner, learning about new ideas, the spread of any kind of information or innovation across social systems. While close friends are crucial for emotional support and deep connection, don't neglect the power of your weak ties. They often hold the most potential for change, novelty, and new opportunities in your life, precisely because they bridge you to different worlds.
Fascinating. Okay, let's shift gears now and talk about love and relationships. This is an area absolutely packed with myths and commonly held beliefs. Let's start with a big, often quoted statistic, usually used to portray true love as kind of hopeless. 1 in 2 marriages end in divorce. Is that actually accurate?
The infamous 50% divorce rate statistic. It gets thrown around all the time, often with a sense of doom and gloom about marriage. But the reality is that statistic is quite misleading, or at least outdated.
Misleading how? Was it never true?
Well, it might have been close to true back in the late 1970s or early 1980s, which is when divorce rates in the U.S. peaked. But the crucial point is, divorce rates have actually been steadily declining ever since then.
Declining. I don't think most people realize that.
No, that old statistic just stuck in the public consciousness. More recent data paints a different picture. For example, one report looking at marriages formed more recently estimated that about 57% of people are still married to their first spouse after 15 years.
Okay, so significantly better than 50% failure rate.
Yes. And maybe even more importantly, that overall rate hides huge variations based on demographics. This is a crucial factor that often gets overlooked.
What kind of demographics make a difference?
Education and age at marriage seem to be key. When you break down the data, people who finish college and married later in life, specifically after the age of 26, are much, much less likely to get divorced.
How much less likely?
Dramatically. One analysis found that an impressive 81% of college-educated individuals who married after age 26 were still married 20 years later.
81%. That's a completely different story than 1 in 2 end in divorce.
It absolutely is. So, depending on the specific group you're looking at, there's far less reason for pessimism about the longevity of marriage than that old statistic suggests. Context matters hugely.
It's a much more hopeful and nuanced picture. Okay, let's tackle perhaps the most romanticized relationship myth of all time. Opposites attract. Is there any actual truth to that? Does dating someone totally different from you lead to lasting love?
This one. This is arguably the most dangerous relationship myth out there.
Dangerous. Why dangerous?
Because while it makes for fantastic romantic comedy plots, the uptight lawyer falling for the free-spirited artist, right?
Yeah.
Real-life psychological evidence overwhelmingly, consistently disproves it as a basis for long-term relationship success.
So opposites don't attract in reality.
For lasting relationships, no. Research consistently finds that married couples, particularly happy ones, show strikingly high levels of similarity, not difference. Similarity in core values, attitudes, beliefs, even personality traits. Couples with more similar personalities consistently report being happier and more satisfied in their relationships.
But what about that initial spark? Sometimes differences do seem exciting at first.
That's true. Initially, differences can be intriguing, novel, maybe even exotic. They can create that initial spark. But the problem is, in the context of daily life, navigating a long-term partnership, those initial intriguing differences often become persistent sources of conflict and friction.
What was once quirky becomes annoying.
Exactly. That interesting quirk turns into a major nuisance when you have to live with it day in and day out. Think about your closest, most enduring friendships. Are those friends radically different from you, or do they tend to share your core values, your sense of humor, your way of looking at the world?
Yeah, mostly similar, I'd say.
Right? Similarity, compatibility, shared understanding, not clashing opposition, appears to be the bedrock of lasting happiness and stability in intimate relationships. So seeking out your opposite might be exciting short-term, but it's generally not a recipe for long-term success.
Okay, another cherished myth busted. Now, here's one that's perhaps a bit more surprising because it involves something so common. The birth control pill. Millions of women take it, but you're saying it can significantly affect their relationships. How?
Yes, this is a really fascinating and perhaps slightly unsettling area of research that's still developing but showing consistent patterns. It seems the pill can subtly influence partner choice and relationship satisfaction.
Partner choice. How?
There was a large survey involving about 2,500 women. It compared women who were on the pill when they first met and chose their long-term partner versus women who were not on the pill at that time.
And what were the differences later on?
The findings were quite striking. Women who'd been on the pill when they chose their partner reported later, after being with him for some time and possibly off the pill, being less physically attracted to him, less sexually satisfied, and they were also more likely to be the one to initiate a separation if the relationship ended.
Wow. Less attracted, less satisfied, more likely to leave. That's significant. Was there any upside?
Interestingly, yes. Those same women who chose their partner while on the pill reported being more satisfied with him specifically as a father and financial provider.
Okay, that's a strange combination. Less sexual satisfaction, but more satisfaction with fatherly qualities. How on earth does the pill influence all that?
The proposed mechanism lies in hormones, specifically how the pill alters a woman's natural hormonal cycle. Hormonal birth control typically works by suppressing ovulation and changing hormone levels, essentially tricking the body into thinking it's already pregnant. And we know that natural hormonal fluctuations across the menstrual cycle play a significant role in female attraction, particularly towards certain male traits linked to testosterone, like facial masculinity or body sense signaling genetic compatibility. When a woman is on the pill, these natural hormonal signals are dampened or altered.
So it changes who she finds attractive.
Potentially, yes. The theory is that women on the pill, whose bodies are in a pseudo-pregnant hormonal state, may be unconsciously less drawn to markers of high testosterone, which might signal a good genes mate, but maybe less paternal investment, and perhaps more drawn to signs of stability, kindness, and resource provision qualities that would be valuable in a supportive partner during pregnancy and childbearing, like a good potential father.
So she picks a dad type while on the pill.
That's the hypothesis. Then imagine if she later goes off the pill. Her natural hormonal cycle returns, her attraction preferences might shift back towards those more testosterone-linked cues. And suddenly she might start seeing her safe provider partner in a different light, maybe finding him less sexually exciting.
That's a huge, potentially life-altering, unintended consequence of a very common medication that most people are completely unaware of.
It really is.
Yeah.
It underscores the incredibly complex interplay between our biology, our hormones, and our relationship choices and satisfaction. It's
Right.
definitely food for thought.
Absolutely. Okay, one final point on relationships, and this one also really blew my mind when I first heard about it. Apparently, trying to explain why you love someone can actually make you more likely to break up with them later. That sounds completely backwards.
It does sound totally counterintuitive, doesn't it? You'd think gaining clarity on why you love someone would strengthen the relationship, but experiments suggest the opposite can happen.
What kind of experiments?
Typically, researchers would bring couples into the lab. One group would be asked simply, how much do you like your partner? Rate your overall feelings. The other group would be asked, please list the reasons why you like your partner. Analyze your relationship.
Okay, focusing on feelings versus focusing on reasons.
Exactly. And the consistent finding was that the couples who were prompted to analyze the reasons for their feelings, those who considered why, rather than just trusting their overall gut instinct, tended to show more change in their attitudes towards their relationship immediately afterwards. And crucially, they were significantly more likely to have actually broken up when researchers followed up with them several months later, sometimes as long as 6 months later.
More likely to break up just from listing reasons? Why would that happen?
The thinking is that the feeling of love, that deep romantic connection, is incredibly complex. It involves a huge amount of unconscious processing, gut feelings, things that are very difficult, maybe impossible, to fully articulate in words.
Okay.
So when you force yourself to come up with specific conscious reasons, I love him because he's funny, I love her because she's smart, those reasons will inevitably be an incomplete and possibly inaccurate representation of the whole complex feeling. They'll severely underplay all the subconscious stuff.
So the reasons you list aren't the whole story.
Not even close. And then what happens? You've now got these conscious, maybe slightly flimsy reasons in your head. And if your partner then does something that contradicts one of those reasons, say the smart partner says something really dumb or the funny partner tells a terrible joke, you might start to question the reason itself. And because you've artificially elevated those conscious reasons, questioning them might lead you to start reevaluating the entire relationship based on an incomplete and fragile foundation.
Whereas if you just trusted the overall feeling, you might brush off the dumb comment more easily.
Precisely. Overanalyzing, trying to dissect love into logical bullet points, might actually undermine the holistic, often subconscious basis of the feeling itself.
That's a profound thought. So the advice is maybe it's best not to overanalyze or try too hard to explain exactly why you love someone. Just trust the feeling.
Based on this research, that might actually be the wiser course for relationship stability. Sometimes, the most important truths are felt more deeply than they can ever be articulated.
Wow. Okay, let's move beyond personal relationships now and look at some broader societal issues, particularly around bias and division. Starting with something seemingly basic. How good are we really at spotting liars? Because that seems like a pretty fundamental skill for navigating social interactions, business, even politics.
You'd think it would be crucial, wouldn't you? And most people tend to think they're pretty good at it. But the research consistently shows that, on average, people are terrible lie detectors.
Terrible! How bad?
The average accuracy rate hovers around 54%.
54%. That's barely better than flipping a coin, which would be 50%.
Exactly. Just 4% better than random chance. And this poor performance is largely because, for decades, both popular belief and even some research focused heavily on supposed behavioral tells of lying, things like nervousness, fidgeting, avoiding eye contact, shifting in your seat.
Yeah, all the stuff you see in movies. The sweaty palms, the shifty eyes.
Right. And it turns out most of those common cues are completely unreliable indicators of deception. The U.S. government actually spent something like $900 million training airport security officers and other agents on spotting these kinds of behavioral cues, despite a real lack of solid scientific foundation for many of them.
Millions spent on training based on shaky science.
Pretty much. A major meta-analysis looked at all the research examining 88 potential behavioral cues. They found only 24 were even slightly correlated with lying, and even those correlations were tiny, barely perceivable by a normal observer. Things like fidgeting, eye contact duration, hand movements, they found virtually no reliable correlation with telling a lie.
So it's no surprise that training program didn't work well.
Not at all. According to reports, that specific behavioral detection program failed to identify a single terrorist, despite the massive investment. Relying on those old cues is largely a losing game.
Okay, so if body language isn't the key, what does work? Is there any reliable way to improve lie detection?
There is some promising recent research focusing on a different approach called cognitive loading.
Cognitive loading, what's that?
The basic idea is that lying is generally more mentally taxing, more cognitively demanding than telling the truth.
Why?
Because if you're telling the truth, you just recall what happened. If you're lying, you have to invent a plausible story, constantly monitor it to make sure it's consistent, suppress the actual truth, and watch the listener's reaction, all at the same time. It takes more brain power.
Okay, lying is hard work for the brain.
It is. So the cognitive loading approach says, if you can strategically increase the cognitive load on a person while they're talking, you might reach a point where a liar starts to falter or make mistakes because their cognitive resources are overloaded, while a truth teller, having an easier task, can still manage.
So you try to make their brain work even harder. How do you do that?
There are a few tactics being researched. For example, one experiment found that asking participants to tell their story backwards, in reverse chronological order.
Backwards, that sounds really hard.
It is, especially if you're trying to keep a fabricated story straight. That tactic alone led to a 20% improvement in lie detection accuracy in that study. Another approach is asking completely unexpected questions that the liar wouldn't have prepared for. Some studies using clever, unexpected questioning techniques got accuracy rates up towards 80%.
80%, that's a massive improvement over 54%. But you said this research is still relatively new.
That's right. This cognitive loading approach is promising, but it's still a developing area. It requires skillful application and more research. So we shouldn't suddenly think we're all expert lie detectors using these tricks yet. But it certainly strongly suggests that focusing on cognitive cues rather than unreliable body language is a much more fruitful path forward.
Very interesting. Okay, next, let's tackle something that feels incredibly relevant today. Political division. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt has argued that political prejudice, basically hating someone simply because they hold different political beliefs, might actually be the strongest form of prejudice operating in some societies today, stronger even than racism or sexism in certain contexts. That's a really bold claim.
It is a very bold claim, and a deeply concerning one, if true. But the evidence he and others point to is compelling and worth considering seriously. Political prejudice, the visceral dislike or distrust of people on the other side politically, seems to be incredibly powerful and pervasive.
What kind of evidence supports this idea?
Well, consider studies looking at things like hiring or evaluation decisions. In one study, participants were asked to choose between two hypothetical scholarship applicants. The applicants were matched on qualifications, but differed in their stated political views, and sometimes race. The finding was that people chose the applicant who shared their political views a staggering 80% of the time, even if the other candidate was arguably more qualified on paper. Political alignment trumped qualifications. And interestingly, in this specific study design, racial discrimination in the choices was basically non-existent, suggesting the political bias was much stronger in that context.
Wow. That's truly alarming, prioritizing political agreement over competence to such a degree. And it seems to warp our basic thinking too, right?
It absolutely does. It can lead to completely illogical valuations based purely on party labels. For example, give a group of Democrats two detailed education policy plans. Label one Republican plan and the other Democrat plan. Unsurprisingly, about 75% will say they favor the Democrat plan.
Okay, standard partisanship.
But here's the twist. Take the exact same two policy plans, but this time just swap the labels. Now, the original Democrat plan is labeled Republican and vice versa. Present these to a different group of Democrats. What happens? Now, about 80% of them choose the policies that are now under the Republican label, the very same policies they rejected when they had the Democrat label.
So they're following the label, not evaluating the actual policy content.
It strongly suggests a blind following of party lines, or perhaps a deep-seated negative reaction to the opposing party's label, rather than a rational assessment of the policies themselves. Our political identity overrides our judgment.
That's a powerful demonstration of how deeply this tribalism can affect us. What are the broader consequences of such strong political prejudice?
The consequences are huge. It poisons public discussion on critical issues. Think about climate change, immigration, gun control, public health. Instead of debating solutions, we get stuck in tribal warfare. Our sense of identity, our self-esteem becomes increasingly tied up with our political views, making any disagreement feel like a personal attack. We stop arguing to understand or persuade and start arguing just to signal our virtue to our own side and condemn the other.
It leads to stalemate and division. Is there any way forward? How can we possibly overcome such a corrosive form of prejudice?
It's incredibly difficult. But there is some intriguing research hinting at a possible avenue. It involves self-affirmation theory, which we touched on earlier.
Self-affirmation, how does that help with political bias?
Surprisingly, experiments have found that if you first have people engage in a self-affirmation exercise, like writing about something deeply important to them personally, totally unrelated to politics, maybe their close relationships, their artistic values, their sense of humor.
Okay, reminding them of their core values outside of politics.
Exactly. After doing that, they become significantly more open to considering arguments and evidence that go against their existing political views. They're less defensive, less likely to just dismiss counter-evidence out of hand.
Why would affirming yourself on something unrelated make you more open politically?
The theory is that political beliefs are often tied to our ego, our sense of self-worth. When our political views are challenged, it feels like a threat to our identity. But if you first prop up that sense of self-worth in a different domain, I'm a good friend, I'm creative, it provides a kind of psychological buffer. You feel more secure in your overall identity, less threatened by the political disagreement, and therefore more willing to engage with different ideas objectively.
So boosting someone's ego in one area might make them less defensive in another.
It seems counterintuitive, but that's what the results suggest. It implies that maybe, just maybe, finding ways to affirm people's value outside the political battlefield could help lower the temperature and open doors for more constructive dialogue.
That's a fascinating, if unexpected, potential strategy. It reinforces the idea that it's not about being right all the time, but about maintaining a commitment to seeking truth, even when it challenges our deeply held beliefs, in order to bridge this destructive divide.
It really demands a level of intellectual humility and emotional regulation that is often sorely lacking in today's political climate.
Absolutely. Okay, finally, let's turn to another incredibly important and sensitive societal issue: racism, and specifically how the popular ideal of achieving a colorblind society where we just don't see race might actually be counterproductive, according to psychological research.
Right. The idea of a colorblind society sounds noble, doesn't it? Treating everyone exactly the same, pretending race doesn't exist or doesn't matter. It comes from a good intention of wanting equality.
Seems like the ideal goal.
It does, in theory. But the problem is, Psychological research strongly suggests two things. First, humans can't actually stop noticing race. It's a visually salient category that our brains process automatically. And second, pretending race doesn't matter often allows unconscious biases to persist and operate unchecked.
So we can't just switch off our perception of race.
The evidence says no, and unconscious biases related to race are depressingly robust. Consider the shoot-don't-shoot experiments. These are computer simulations where participants have to quickly decide whether to shoot or not shoot targets who pop up holding either a weapon or a harmless object, like a phone or wallet. The targets are varied by race.
Okay, what do they find?
Consistently, participants, and this includes black participants as well, are quicker and more likely to mistakenly shoot an unarmed black suspect than an unarmed white suspect. Conversely, they're slower and more likely to mistakenly not shoot an armed white suspect compared to an armed black suspect.
Wow, that's a clear bias in threat perception based on race, even when the objective information, weapon or not, is the same.
Exactly. Brain imaging studies done during these tasks even show a larger amygdala response, the brain's threat detection center, when participants view black faces compared to white faces, suggesting a deep-seated unconscious association of race with threat for many people.
That's incredibly disturbing, especially how automatic and unconscious it seems. Are there other examples of these persistent biases?
Plenty, unfortunately. Another classic is the resume study. Researchers sent out nearly 5,000 identical resumes in response to job ads in Boston and Chicago. The only difference was the name at the top. Some had stereotypically white-sounding names, like Emily or Greg, while others had equally common but stereotypically black-sounding names, like Lakeisha or Jamal.
Identical resumes, just different names. What happened?
The resumes with white-sounding names received 50% more callbacks for interviews than the identical resumes with black-sounding names.
50% more callbacks, just based on the name.
Yes. The study calculated that having a white-sounding name conferred as much benefit in getting a callback as having an extra 8 years of work experience on the resume. And perhaps even more concerning, having better credentials or more experience on the resume had less positive impact for the applicants with black-sounding names compared to those with white-sounding names. The bias seemed to override qualifications.
So even with identical or better qualifications, unconscious bias associated with names significantly impacts opportunities right from the first step.
It clearly does.
Yeah.
And this gets to the core problem with the colorblind mentality. If we just pretend race doesn't exist or doesn't matter, we ignore these very real ongoing biases and disparities. Pretending to be colorblind and therefore not talking about race or racism can actually make things worse because it prevents us from acknowledging and addressing the unconscious biases that are clearly still operating.
So silence allows the bias to fester.
It seems so. Research with children, for example, shows how early these categories form. Even at age 3, children tend to make same-race choices for friends. By age 6, if you ask them to sort photos of faces, they're more likely to sort them by race than by gender, even when gender is an equally obvious visual category. Race becomes a primary sorting mechanism very early on, even if adults try not to talk about it.
So if pretending to be colorblind is counterproductive, what's the solution? How do we deal with these ingrained biases?
The consensus from this line of research is that it's essential to talk about race and racism openly and honestly. We need to educate ourselves and others about these biases, acknowledge their existence, both conscious and unconscious, in order to actively work against them.
So conscious awareness and effort are key.
Yes, and research does show that conscious suppression of racial biases is possible, even if the bias itself is automatic. For example, one study looking at mock jurors in a rape case found that a simple reminder just before deliberation to avoid prejudice based on race successfully eliminated the bias that was otherwise present in their judgments. So, awareness and intention matter. The key is, we have to admit that racism still exists, even in subtle, unconscious forms, if we're ever going to effectively deal with it head-on through conscious effort, policy changes, and continuous open dialogue. Ignoring it won't make it go away.
That's a really important message. Acknowledgement, not avoidance, is the path forward. Wow, we've covered so much ground today.
We truly have. It's been a real journey through the mind. Today, we've taken this deep dive into those hidden currents of human psychology, uncovering how things like our willpower, our creativity, our everyday decisions are shaped by forces we often really misunderstand.
Yeah.
We've seen how our brains take these fascinating, sometimes flawed shortcuts, how our social connections create ripples far beyond our immediate circles, and how these deep-seated biases can influence everything from who we trust and love to how we view these really critical societal issues.
This deep dive has really shown, I think, that common sense. It's often just the very beginning of the story, isn't it?
Exactly. True understanding seems to come from looking beneath that surface, from challenging those initial assumptions and easy answers.
And the goal of doing this deep dive, for you listening, isn't just about collecting more interesting facts, although hopefully it was interesting. It's really about providing insights that can empower you.
Mm-hmm. Empower you to make more informed choices in your own life, maybe understand your own reactions a bit better, and engage with the world around you and the people in it with maybe a bit more clarity and perhaps even more empathy.
Recognizing those psychological undercurrents that are shaping our reality all the time.
Exactly. So as we wrap up, what does this all mean for you? If our own minds can be so easily swayed by these unseen biases, these subtle influences, and if our reality is constantly being shaped by forces both conscious and unconscious, here's a final thought to leave you with.
Okay.
What long-held belief, or maybe just a common assumption that you've always accepted, are you now willing to put under the psychological microscope after hearing all this? What piece of common wisdom or personal conviction will you choose to unpack next?